In this episode, we'll give you some advice on how to improve your reading skills in English, whether you're reading for pleasure or for academic purposes. We'll give you some tips on how to do it better. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés con Reza y Craig.
Hello and welcome. My name's Craig.
And my name's Reza.
And if you're a new listener, we are two teachers with over 50 years of teaching between us. And we're going to help you improve your English and take it to the next level. Welcome to the podcast. How are you, Reza?
I'm very well, Craig. It's nice to see you. It's been a while.
It's been 8 weeks since we were together in my flat recording a podcast. Now, if you're a new listener, just to let you know that we do record these episodes in advance during the summer. So the episodes you have recently heard were recorded back in, when was it? June, July?
June, July. Early July was the last time we recorded.
Yeah, so it's been a while. How was your summer?
Busy. I went away because I was actually working in Belfast in a university where I come from. So it was a nice experience because most of my students there were Chinese and Arabic students. So it made a change from Spanish-speaking students. Yeah, it was nice.
So you were teaching them to do academic English?
Yes, my summer course was specifically only for EAP, English for Academic Purposes. So as far as their reading was concerned, we spent a lot of time talking about reading textbooks and useful sources for research and reading around your subject area, all academic reading. That's what I was focusing on over the summer.
Very cool.
What about you, Craig? What have you been up to?
Well, I didn't work this summer. Well, I did work, but I did not work in August. I had a lovely vacation or holiday in Ethiopia, which was a really interesting country to visit. And I went there with a group of Spanish speakers on a package holiday. And we basically drove around the country and got to know how people live and saw the way of life. And beautiful, beautiful country, very green and very hilly and interesting. So, yeah, that was my holiday in August, just for 2 weeks.
I'm going to presume that most of you in that group couldn't speak the Ethiopian language. Amharic it's called, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. In the north of the country, they speak Amharic. No, I did learn one or two expressions and phrases, but no, we couldn't really speak. But many people spoke English. So we did have conversations with people in English, especially in the capital, Addis Ababa.
You guessed my next question. My question was going to be, what was the language you got by on? English, yeah.
It was English, yeah. And I had to translate quite often for people in the group. We had a Spanish guide, so I had to translate sometimes what the local people were saying into Spanish because they spoke to me in English. They didn't speak Spanish. And I translated for the group. There were 17 of us. I translated into Spanish so that everybody could understand what was happening. It was fun. It was really, really nice. I came back rested. Did you come back relaxed and rested or stressed?
Quite tired, but relaxed when my course was over. It was very enjoyable, but I'm kind of having my real summer holiday now.
And we start teaching again in a week or so. Please forgive the delay in replying to your emails. First of all, thank you very much for all the feedback and the lovely emails and voice messages that you sent to Reza and I over the summer. We've got lots of ideas and lots of messages that we can use in future podcasts. So thank you very much for that. And please be a little bit patient if you don't hear answers to your questions that you've sent in to us, that you sent us. We promise we'll answer your questions in the next few weeks. So please be patient and we'll do that as soon as we can. I just want to say many, many thanks to people who have been commenting and giving us reviews on Apple Podcasts, on iTunes. In particular, Beatriz Galashi, Alba Varero, and Kiki-san 3639. Thank you very much for your 5-star reviews and your kind words on iTunes.
Craig, I believe we have a voice message from Ricardo. Is that right?
We do. Ricardo is asking us how he can improve his reading skills.
Hello, Greg and Reza. First of all, thank you very much for your podcast. I really love it. I usually hear it a lot, and I would like to ask you about what would you recommend to improve my English reading skills, because I sometimes try to read some books in English, and some of them are a little difficult, and not because some words that I don't get or that I've never had before. That happens also, but sometimes it's just that I don't quite get what they are telling me, or if I do, I forget it easily, and it's hard to me to keep on with the reading. Thank you very much, and bye.
Well, Ricardo, thank you very much for your voice message. It was very clear. We understand you very well. Have you any comments on it, Craig?
I also enjoyed the message that Ricardo sent. It was very easy to understand. Just one very small thing at the end with a preposition. You said it's very hard to me. What would be better is to change that preposition to for. So it was very hard for me to understand. It was very hard for me to do the exercise. It was very difficult for me to send the message.
Yes, and one more other little thing. You said that you hear it. You hear it, our podcast. But what you mean is you listen to it. When you hear something, it means you didn't really plan it. Like if a bomb explodes right now outside the flat, I hope it doesn't, but it certainly wouldn't be planned by me, so I would hear it. But our podcast is planned, as you know, and we release it every Sunday.
Kind of planned.
More or less.
More or less.
So many people choose to listen to it. They make an effort. It's not just spontaneous. It's not by chance.
We heard a noise as we were recording before when we stopped because your phone made a noise.
Yeah, we had to re-record this bit.
But we weren't listening to that noise on the phone. It was just a notification, a beep. So we just heard it. We were not actively listening to it. Yeah.
So it's a very common mistake, Ricardo. Hear and listen to, not quite the same.
So we did like Ricardo's question about reading, and we gave some recommendations back in episode 177. This particular episode was about writing an email to tech support, but we did speak quite a bit during that episode concerning reading. We gave some book recommendations, what books maybe you could read to practice your English. For example, Harry Potter is very popular. Animal Farm by George Orwell, one of Reza's favourites. Bridget Jones' Diary could be interesting. Authors, writers, Reza, what did we recommend in that episode for authors that could be interesting?
Yes, I think you mentioned George Orwell, yeah. Another one is Ernest Hemingway. Mm-hmm. Always a good choice because nice, clear, good stories and easy to read. Neil Gaiman, I'm not sure if all of you have heard of him, but he's a very good writer. That's Gaiman, Neil Gaiman. He writes really nice short stories as well as longer novels. And Bill Bryson, who doesn't usually write fiction as far as I know. He's more famous for his non-fiction.
And travel books, yeah.
Yeah, so he writes about things which are true, although he might spice them up a little bit, but things like information about travel or comparing the Americans with the British. It's very interesting because I think actually he originally is American, isn't he?
Yes, he was born in Iowa.
In Iowa, yeah.
And he lived in the UK for many years, and his writing is quite funny and not very difficult for a B2 C1 level student. So it's definitely a person you should check out and go and read.
You might be a bit surprised that I've mentioned George Orwell. It's true, I'm a big fan of his. He's known for, quite philosophical and ideas and very interested in the politics of his day. But don't let that fool you. George Orwell was obsessed, very obsessed with the idea that English should be clear and simple. He wrote essays about it, and he went out of his way to make a big effort to make sure that there were no unnecessary, complicated phrases or expressions in his writing. It was something that he took really, really seriously. So he actually consciously made an effort to make his English simple. So he actually is very easy for most people to understand. His words, although his ideas might be a bit unusual or even ahead of their time, his actual English is very, very clear.
So that will be a good suggestion to start with. And if you would like more suggestions and tips on books, on authors, go to inglespodcast.com/177. Listen to that episode, and all of the links and the recommendations are in the show notes on the website.
So, Craig, what can our listeners actually do? Okay, they've got to read, but what are they doing while they're reading? How do they read? How are they going to get better at reading?
The best way to improve is, I know it's said very, very often, is practice, 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 practice. And if you think about it, it's like anything else. If you want to learn to ride a bicycle, you have to practice. If you're driving a car to get your license, what do? You practice. Skiing, tennis, anything you want to get good at, you just have to keep doing it. So I know it's said very often, and we say this very often with listening and reading and grammar and vocabulary, you have to keep practicing and reading and reading. And the more you read, the easier it will be and the better your reading will be.
Yes, I mean, perhaps it's more obvious for the other skills. I mean, obviously you're not going to get better at speaking if you don't speak. That's more obvious to understand and comprehend. But it's just as important for reading. Don't think that there's a shortcut. A shortcut is like a quick way avoiding the real effort. No, there isn't. You have to read plenty if you want to get better at reading, just like you have to speak plenty if you want to get better at speaking, to listen plenty if you want to get better at listening, and that's why you're listening to this podcast, I suppose. And if you want to get better at writing, you got to write, and there's no way around that.
Yeah, absolutely. And because we're suggesting that you read a lot, it obviously makes sense that you choose books that you enjoy reading. I mentioned earlier Bridget Jones' Diary, which, if you've seen the film, it's kind of a romantic comedy. So if you don't really like romantic comedies, don't read that book. You have to go with the genres and the fiction, the kind of stories and books that you enjoy reading in Spanish, and read that genre or that type of book in English. And try to vary your reading as well. So not only fiction and long form reading, but also anything in English that you can read that's slightly different in format. Read that as well. I mean news, I mean the instructions on your washing machine, I mean the ingredients in the food you're eating that may be in English. Anything you can read in English is going to be good.
These days, pretty much all well-known or important books, and even lesser-known books, exist in English, even if the original language isn't English. So what you could do is read a book in English that you've read previously in Spanish. I mean, all the Spanish language classics, they've all been translated into English. I mean, I read in English first Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude. Marquez, yeah, it's translated. I read that in English first, just because somebody lent it to me, not because I especially wanted to read it in English first, but someone lent me a translation. I read it in English first. Later, I read it in Spanish. It was very nice. So there's probably books that you've already read in Spanish. Read them in English. And since you've already read them in Spanish, you know what happens. You may have forgotten a few details, but it'll come back to you quickly when you read. And so you'll get through the English much quicker if it's a book that you've already read before, because you already know the story more or less.
Would you recommend them watching the film of the book first? For example, 1984, there was a film made of that, but obviously Bridget Jones' Diary and other famous books, The Hunger Games. Would you suggest that and then read the book after? Because some of them are adaptations, they're not exactly the same.
That's a good question. I think it certainly has its advantages from a language learning point of view. But of course, there are some people who are more purist, let's say. And if the book's the original, then they like to read the book first. So I think it depends on the individual. It certainly is, from an educational point of view, very useful to watch the film first. But I can understand that there'll be some people who say, no. If the book's the original, then I want to read the book first. I can understand that idea.
Would you? I prefer to read the book first. In fact, very often the book's much better than the film.
Yeah.
Or there's some kind of interpretation in your mind that your imagination creates characters and scenes in your head. And when you watch the film, it's like, I didn't imagine it like this. This is completely different to what I thought it was going to be. Does that happen to you?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I like the idea of reading a book first because then I, in my mind, imagine the characters. I vaguely see their faces in my mind. But if it's done for you already in a film, well, then your imagination isn't stimulated that way. That's the downside, I guess.
Another tip or piece of advice concerning dictionaries, try not to use dictionaries for every word that you see that you don't understand. I know it can be a little frustrating sometimes. There's a word on the page, you don't know what it means. Try to guess the word from context. Read the sentence again, look at the words around it and think, well, what could that mean? Is that a verb? Is that an adjective? What could it mean in this context? And if that word appears again later in the text and it starts to bother you and annoy you, then maybe go to the dictionary and check it. But very often you could you can understand what's happening without understanding every word. Of course, some ebooks these days, the Amazon Kindle, for example, they have dictionaries built into the software of the e-reader. So it's very easy to just put your finger on the word and it will give you a translation in Spanish.
Now, here's an idea for some of you who like, let's say, a bit of a challenge. We spoke earlier about if you're a Spanish speaker, if you've already read a book in Spanish, why not then try later reading it in English? What about the other way around? What about that? What about if you're a Spanish speaker? Why not read the book first in English? Yeah, but try not to look up the words you don't know. Now, that's hard. You're going to have to try and resist temptation. There will be bits that you don't understand and you'd like to, but be brave. Try not to look up any words. Read it all in English. Then, the second reading, do that in Spanish, which of course you'll understand. And then do a third reading and go back and read it a second time in English. And you'll be surprised now how much of the English you didn't understand the first time, now you do understand without, hopefully, having had to look them up. Because in the middle, you read it in Spanish. Now, of course, you need time for that. I appreciate that. But if you do it that way, it's really rewarding when you get really difficult vocabulary sometimes without having used a dictionary. And in fact, your understanding of that new vocabulary or new expressions will be much deeper because you didn't just look it up in a dictionary and were given lots of options. You had to think about it, then you got the exact meaning in Spanish, and then you went back to the English and you truly understood it because now you know what it means in Spanish from the context. The key is the word context. You didn't just look it up in a dictionary. The context gave you the true meaning of it.
And you've given this advice, I think, with video as well. Watch it first in English, then watch it in Spanish, then go back and watch the film or TV series in English a third time.
Yep. Takes time. I appreciate that, but it really works. Listen, I did it myself, everybody. But I did, obviously, the reverse. way because English is my first language. To improve my Spanish, can you believe that about 20 years ago, when my Spanish was much worse even than now, I read El Don Quixote first in Spanish. Now that was not easy because it's a long book and it's a hard book and it's written in old-fashioned, very flowery, very colorful Spanish. But I stuck with it and I read it all in Spanish, and there was plenty I didn't understand. Then I breathed a sigh of relief, took up the English copy, read that, understood it all, and thought, right, now I'm going to go back to the Spanish. And I got most of it the second time around.
And did you get the pleasure the third time of reading it in original version?
Yes, I did, because it's like, hey, I'm reading El Quixote, no less than El Quixote, in Spanish, and I'm understanding it. Wow, brilliant.
Yeah.
I've done it with other books as well, but I give El Quixote as an example because, as you probably all know, it's not an easy book to read.
Yeah, I gave up in the first chapter. I didn't last longer than about 2 or 3 days, I think. We've mentioned this before, the idea of intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Well, what are they? Well, if you really enjoy doing something, that's inside you. That's your motivation from inside. You really enjoy science fiction, for example. Extrinsic motivation could be a job promotion or passing an exam, that you really need this for your degree, let's say. So you want the certificate. There is a difference, I think, between reading for relaxation, that sit back and enjoy on the sofa reading, and reading because you need to improve your reading comprehension to pass the B2 first exam or the C1 exam. So why not combine the two? Find a genre that you like and read a book that you enjoy in English. But at the same time, if you're studying for an exam, you also need to answer questions in a reading comprehension exam. So you need to sometimes combine the two. Do you agree with that, Reza?
Yeah, of course. We all have to do things in life we don't want to, but think of the rewards. As Craig said, extrinsic motivation. Think about what you're going to get when you achieve this goal, which could be reading something successfully in English. So, you've got to go through a little bit of pain to get the pleasure of achieving what you want at the end. And the more pain you go through at the beginning, the less pain there'll be at the end, and the more pleasure, because it will become easier. As we've said, as you practice more, the pain level goes down and the pleasure level goes up.
And you know what they say? No pain, no gain. No pain, no gain. Why not read a paragraph, then close the book and write down any important points that you remember, and then go back and read the paragraph again? Did you miss anything? Did you summarize correctly what you read? Are there any difficult words you want to check in that paragraph? So choose a paragraph, any paragraph in the book, read it, close the book, make notes, open the book and reread it again to see how accurate your summary is.
I think this method is good for all reading, but it's especially useful and pretty much necessary for academic reading. I was talking a lot about this with my university students over the summer. So they were interested in academic reading. They were getting ready to go to university to study in English, a foreign language for them. And a very important thing is not to plagiarize, not to copy the words from books or other sources.
No copy pasting.
No copy paste, yeah, but to put it into your own words. So you're expected to read a lot at university, but you're expected to put that information that you read into other words. So this is exactly what you want to be doing. Read the paragraph, the section, as Craig said, write down the main points, then go back, check, did you understand? And the more you can change the original language to your own, the better, to avoid being accused of plagiarism. Don't write too much. Only write the main points. You don't even have to write sentences. Just write notes. It's better to check that you got the main ideas. So especially good for academic reading.
Habit forming can really help improve your reading over time. So why not create a habit of just 10 to 15 minutes every night before you go to sleep. And if you're like me and you like watching Netflix and screens and working on computers or watching TV series, then it's not a good idea to go straight to bed after watching a screen or engaging with a screen. I find personally that reading just for 10, 15 minutes helps to calm down my brain and relax me, and it's much easier to fall asleep. And try to do that every single night, like brushing your teeth. So it becomes a habit. You don't think about it. 10 to 15 minutes of English, and probably that will put you to sleep.
Yeah. Another danger, I'm saying this a bit now, tongue-in-cheek. Tongue-in-cheek means like joking. If you watch Netflix series just before you go to bed, I did this with a well-known Colombian series. And I really like the language they use. But the problem is, because I watched it just before I went to bed, every night for about 2 weeks, I woke up in the morning saying, "Hola, papi," to everyone. Oye, papi, ¿qué tal? I thought, no, I better not. I'm not in Bogota or Medellin. If I go down the street saying, "Oye, papi," people are going to think I'm crazy. But because it was the last thing I heard at night, like, it came out in the morning. So that's another danger about watching too much Netflix just before you go to bed.
That happened to me last night. I was watching a series on Netflix based in London, but in a working class area of London with gangsters. I think it was called Top Boy. And they would say, "Hey, blood," and "Hey, man." And it was very London kind of street talk. Like, "Hey, bro," and really, really weird. And that was in my head when I woke up this morning. We suggested before that you watch a film first and then read the book. One or two recommendations if you're interested in doing that. I particularly like a writer called Nick Hornby. Nick Hornby wrote very good books that were made into films later on, notably About a Boy with Hugh Grant. In my opinion, one of the few Hugh Grant films that are really good, that he acted really well in. There's High Fidelity with John Cusack and Jack Black. That's a film about music, if you're into music. And football, my team is Arsenal, and Nick Hornby is an Arsenal fan, and he wrote a book called Fever Pitch, and the film stars Colin Firth. So those are recommendations that are also in the show notes. Another possibility, The Great Gatsby, which is a classic. Have you read that?
I have a long time ago, yes. But since then, I've seen so many cinema adaptations.
There's been like 3 or 4. Yeah.
I can barely remember the original book, but it's a good book, isn't it? Yeah.
Yep.
And it's not hard to read. Not hard at all.
Very easy to read. So try that. That's a good suggestion.
I've read High Fidelity, and like you, I really liked all the references to music. I haven't actually seen the film adaptation. I must
it's very
look
good
for it, but I really enjoyed the book. Another thing you could do is, of course, join a reading club, or maybe a Facebook group centered around reading, whichever you prefer. If you want to actually go and physically meet people and then you enjoy more of the social event, perhaps going to a club's better for you. But there are plenty of Facebook groups which talk about books these days. And not only is it good fun listening to other people's opinions and giving your own, let's be honest, we all like giving our own opinion from time to time, but you'll really improve your English.
If you're a teacher, and I know that some teachers do listen to the podcast, we have quite a few listeners who are teachers, why not start a book review podcast with your students? And this idea came from last weekend. I was presenting at a conference in Valencia, and some teachers came to the talk. And one teacher working in Valencia asked her students during the summer to choose a book, any book, read the book, and then record a review for her on their phone and send it to her. And I thought that was a wonderful idea, because the students can choose any book they like. They're reading during the summer, and then they're recording and practicing their speaking, and they can re-record to improve the message every time, and the review is spoken and then sent to the teacher, who then gives feedback. So there's an idea. If you are a teacher, why don't you get your students to read a book and then record a review and send it via their phone to the teacher?
As well as all those tips we've just mentioned, there are plenty of resources out there online mostly free to help you. For example, if you simply want a good list of books to read, you could go to goodreads.com/list, and they have an updated list of good reads. Now, the word read, I'm sure you know as a verb, but perhaps you didn't know it's also a noun. So a good read is something which is good to read, as you can imagine. So goodreads.com/list.
All of these resources are listed on the webpage. Go to inglespodcast.com/280. Jellybooks, Jelly, jellybooks.com is a website that will give you some free books to download in return for your reading data. So they are tracking how frequently you read, how often you read, but they will supply you with some free books. So there's another resource for you there, Jellybooks.
If getting free books isn't enough for you, you could even get some money. You can actually earn money. If you read and review a book, you can do it with onlinebookclub.org. I'll say that again, onlinebookclub.org. As Craig said, you can get all these addresses on the show notes, and they will pay between $5 and up to $60 for you to read and then write a review of books online for them.
Every 2 weeks, the Mansion Inglés, the website that I contribute to, publishes a Cuaderno de Inglés, a newsletter. And once a month, in the second newsletter, I adapt a short passage from Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. If you've ever tried to read that in English, Tom Sawyer has some language that's based in the south of the United States. It's not always easy to follow, so I'm adapting it and making the English a bit more modern and a bit easier to follow. I'm simplifying quite a lot of the language, and then I write some comprehension questions based on what I've adapted. And it's serialized, so every month there's a little bit more of text. So if you're not ready to dive in, to jump in and read a complete book, you could sign up for the newsletter and follow Tom Sawyer. If you want to go back to episode 1 of this reading comprehension, I think it was probably 2 years ago. So go to cuadernodeingles.com, where you can find all of the previous cuadernos or newsletters going back to 2002 or 2003, I think. So there are many, many, many cuadernos on the website.
So Craig, you simplify the English a little bit,
because
it's this very specific kind of dialect from Southern United States, so that your followers can understand it, yeah?
Yep, it's a simplified text. So it's kind of like the idea of a graded reader, where a famous book is simplified depending on the level of the student. So I would say this is simplified for a B2 level student, and the comprehension questions are more or less intermediate.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about graded readers in general? These books that have been specially prepared according to different levels.
I think they're a good idea, and I think any reading in English is better than no reading at all. I would be very curious if it's a famous book to read the original rather than the adapted version. But definitely if your level is not sort of C1 and above, maybe a graded reader is a great way to start reading in English. And then when your reading improves, you can go to the original version. What's your opinion on it?
Exactly the same as you, yeah. If it's a really famous book, you might be curious to wait until your level's a bit higher and read the original. But a lot of graded readers are original material. So they've been written first as a graded reader. So you're not spoiling, you're not ruining anything by reading it. It's been written specifically for that reason.
Yeah.
And the beauty is that it kind of tells you more or less your level. So it's written for B1 or B2 or whatever. There aren't many readers, though, really above B2, are there? C1, maybe a few, but after that, once you get to about C1, you should be trying to, as much as possible, read
the original. Yeah,
from C1 kind of onwards, and definitely C2.
Yeah. I mentioned mansioningles.com before. There's also a reading section on mansioningles.com. There's a link to that in the show notes. And my friend and partner Luis has been writing some very, very good articles in Spanish with tips and advice on various aspects of English. And one thing is how to improve your English. And it's written in Spanish. It's very accessible. So if you'd like more information, the link is in the show notes.
And now it's your turn to practice your English. We've been talking about reading. You got to write something for it to be read. If you want to write, you can write to us. You can write to Craig at craig@inglespodcast.com or to me, belfastreza@gmail.com. Or if you want us to listen to you, what can they do, Craig?
Why not send us a voice message on SpeakPipe? That's speakpipe.com. speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. There you can send your voice message of a maximum of 90 seconds, a minute and a half, and tell us what you've been reading. Tell us what books you like. Tell us what you've enjoyed, and maybe recommend to other listeners of the podcast, and we will include your voice message in a future episode.
So you can speak to us or you can write to us. And according to what you do, we will either listen to you or we will read you.
But we prefer to hear your voices. It's much more personal. Before we go, we'd like to thank our wonderful patrons who continue to support us wonderfully every month with a $1 donation and receive in return access to transcriptions transcribed by Angelica. Go to patreon.com, that's patreon.com/Ingles podcast if you would like to join that community of supporters. There's some news on Patreon which I'd like to mention quickly. There's a new EU law in the European Union this month, at the time of recording, that's September 2019, which requires businesses like Patreon to add an extra security step. So if you do join the Patreon program and you're asked for your credit card, of course, for your $1 contribution every month, they may ask for another security step. So you may get something from your bank with a password or a special code sent to your mobile phone. I'm mentioning this so that you don't get worried if something changes. For example, you change your credit card and you continue supporting us. Just be aware, just know that the law's changing in Europe. And if you're a European credit card holder, you may be asked for an extra security step.
We would love to be able to name all our Patreon sponsors, but I'm afraid we don't have time. But what we will do is say a big thank you to our new Patreon sponsors and welcome them.
And there are many.
There are.
For the summer.
These are the most recent people who've joined us.
And we want to say thank you to Julen Renteria Autuniano. I'm sorry if I've butchered your name and said it really badly. Oscar Sanchez Molina, Mariluz Lopez Comfort 1.4.
I love that name.
That was how I saw it in the Patreon website. Edward Fonseca, Rox Cole, Nestor Stengel, Fernando del Cerro, Luis Antonio Echeverría Diez, Enrique Delgado, Jesús Acevedo, Francisca Trujillo, María Alejandra Maldonado, José Luis Ortega Morales, and Eder Massa. And last but not least, Patricia Conde. Thanks to all of you for joining us over the summer and helping us to provide transcriptions to this podcast. What's next week?
On next week's episode, for once, finally, something I actually know quite a lot about. Because usually I don't know what I'm talking about.
You know a lot about teaching, my friend. You know a lot about teaching.
I'm not sure that's true. But what I do know about is what to do in Belfast. That's our next episode.
Drink beer, isn't it?
Yeah, basically that's it.
Apart from drinking beer, please join us next week and learn what to do as a tourist if you visit Reza's hometown. Thank you very much for listening. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.